In the silence of the forest, a pair of golden eyes gleamed. 3 bobcats moved down the ridge, silent as drifting shadows. Their paws touched the earth without a sound, as if the night itself carried them. The mother led with fierce, unblinking eyes that cut through the dark. Behind her, 2 restless young bobcats darted in and out of the brush, playful yet alert. Their presence shifted the valley's stillness, as though nature had posted sentinels at the edge of the trees. No one knew it yet, but these wild guardians were about to reveal their true power. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable animal stories. Margaret Hayes had lived in the same cedar-sided log cabin for nearly 4 decades, tucked at the edge of a narrow gravel road that twisted into the heart of the Colorado Rockies. The cabin had been her husband's pride, every board and nail set by his hands, and for years it was filled with warmth. The hum of country music from an old radio, the smell of stew bubbling on the stove, the laughter of friends gathered on the porch. But after Walter Hayes passed away, far too soon, after a short illness that left Margaret both relieved and broken, the house became quieter than she could bear. At 67, Margaret told everyone she was fine. Her daughter Melissa begged her to come down to Denver, closer to the family, closer to the grandchildren who adored her. Her son Daniel offered to move her into a neat townhouse outside Boulder where she would never have to worry about shoveling snow again. But Margaret refused each offer. "This is my home," she would say firmly. What she did not admit out loud was that she clung to the cabin not because it was comfortable, but because leaving it felt like losing Walter all over again. The cabin was a living memory, every creak in the floorboards echoing with his presence. Yet memory had its own sharp edges. Evenings stretched endlessly now. The wind rattling the pines outside no longer sounded friendly, it sounded hollow. The TV filled the space with noise, but no warmth. On cold nights, she kept the kettle going just to have steam rising, something alive in the room. She busied herself with church work and neighborhood bulletins, but the truth was plain. Loneliness had set in like the slow creep of frost across the windows. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was early April, the kind of dawn where mist clings low between the trees and the ground still carries the bite of winter. Margaret woke restless, slipped on her robe, and shuffled to the kitchen. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and the peppermint tea she favored before bed. She drew back the curtains over the sliding glass door, expecting only fog and the pale smear of first light. Instead, she froze. Something moved at the treeline. At first, she thought it was one of the neighborhood deer, a lone doe that sometimes wandered close to the shed. But this shape was different, lower, more deliberate. The creature stepped into the clearing, and Margaret's breath caught in her chest. Its coat was mottled tawny and gray, patterned with faint stripes and spots. Its tufted ears flicked forward, and its golden eyes glowed through the mist like 2 lanterns. A bobcat. Her heart hammered, half with awe and half with fear. She had seen one once, years ago, far off during a hike with Walter, but never this close to her home. And as she leaned closer to the glass, she realized it wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures padded into view behind the first, lanky and uncertain in their steps. Young ones. The mother moved with quiet authority, every step measured, every glance scanning the yard as though weighing whether it was safe. The kittens tumbled after her, cautious but curious, chasing each other in clumsy arcs through the wet grass. Margaret stood transfixed, one hand pressed against the cool window pane, afraid even her breathing might break the spell. Minutes passed in silence, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but charged, like the pause before a hymn begins. Finally, with a flick of her short tail, the mother bobcat turned back toward the woods, the young ones bounding after her. In a blink they were gone, swallowed by the pines. Margaret did not move for a long time. Her tea sat forgotten, growing cold on the counter. Something heavy that had pressed on her chest for years, something she had learned to carry without complaint, felt suddenly lighter. She remembered something Walter used to say whenever they spotted a fox or a hawk on their hikes. "The forest is watching us, same as we watch it." The memory made her smile, a real smile, one she had not felt in months. That day, Margaret noticed everything more sharply. She cleaned the kitchen with unusual energy, humming under her breath. She took Walter's old camera from the closet, dusted it off, checked the battery, and placed it by the window, just in case. Because maybe, just maybe, they would return. That night, she sat in her armchair with a book in her lap, but her gaze wandered often to the sliding door. Nothing appeared in the dark, yet she did not feel cheated. For the first time in years, she wasn't dreading the silence. She was waiting for it to break. By the week's end, they did return. She was sweeping the deck when movement caught her eye near the apple tree. The same mother bobcat, flanked by her two young, stood watchful as the kits tumbled over one another. Margaret held her breath, broom in hand, and stayed perfectly still. They seemed unconcerned by her presence, as though the space belonged to them as much as it did to her. That night, she opened her journal, the one that had gathered dust since Walter died, and wrote for the first time in months. Just a few lines about what she had seen, but enough to mark the moment. They came today. 3 of them. Wild, fierce, and beautiful. I don't feel alone anymore. It was the beginning of something Margaret could not yet understand, a fragile thread tying her solitude to the wilderness. And though she did not know it, those 3 bobcats would one day be more than a marvel. They would become her guardians. The days after the bobcats' first visits carried a strange new energy for Margaret Hayes. She woke earlier, made her tea quicker, and found herself rushing to the window each morning, searching for a glimpse of those wild companions. Sometimes she saw nothing but mist and pine shadows, but hope had replaced dread. For the first time in years, she anticipated the day instead of merely enduring it. But anticipation can be a fragile thing. And on one April night, that fragile thread would snap. It was close to midnight when Margaret first heard the sound. She had settled in bed, a book resting unread on her lap, when a faint squeak carried through the cabin. It was the kind of sound so small you might dismiss it as the wood settling. Except Margaret's ears had grown used to the rhythm of the house. This was different. This was deliberate. A squeal of metal against glass. Her pulse surged. She set the book aside, her fingers trembling as she reached for her phone on the nightstand. The glow of the screen seemed blinding in the darkness, and she cupped it in her palm as though to hide its light. The cabin felt suddenly enormous. Every shadow stretched long and dangerous. She whispered to herself, steadying her voice before dialing. "Stay calm, Margaret. Stay calm." When the dispatcher answered, she forced the words past her dry throat. "Someone's outside. At the window. Please, please send help." The woman's voice on the other end was firm, practiced. "Find a safe place. Stay hidden until officers arrive." Margaret slid quietly from the bed and crept down the hallway, slippers whispering against the floorboards. Her chest ached with the pounding of her heart. As she reached the small spare room, she froze. There it was, the sound again. Metal grinding, slow and methodical. The crank on the old window is inching open. Her knees weakened. He wasn't just outside. He was coming in. She backed away, clutching the phone tight, and slipped into the pantry off the kitchen. It was cramped, smelling of flour and dried herbs, but it gave her a narrow view through a crack in the door. She held her breath as the sound of boots hit hardwood. He was inside. The intruder moved like he had done this before. His flashlight beams swept across the walls, catching family photographs, the edge of the counter, the leather strap of Walter's old camera still sitting by the window. He wore black clothing, gloves, and a mask that turned his face into something faceless, inhuman. In one hand, he carried a pry bar, in the other the heavy flashlight. Margaret's fear coiled into something sharper, anger. This was her home. Every nail, every board had been built with love. Walter's laughter still lived in these walls. No stranger had the right to take that from her. She whispered into the phone again, voice thin but steady. "He's inside. He's in my kitchen." The dispatcher urged her to stay hidden, repeating that officers were on their way. But Margaret knew seconds stretched into eternities during nights like this. Her whole body shook, lungs straining to hold breath as the man turned his head. The flashlight beam swung toward the hallway, toward the pantry where she crouched. The floor groaned under his weight as he stepped closer. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, her mind filled with Walter's face, the years they had shared, the children she might never see again. Fear threatened to break her. And then, a sound split the silence. Low, guttural, vibrating through the glass door. A growl. The man stopped in his tracks. The flashlight swung toward the back of the cabin, and Margaret dared to peek through the crack. 3 shapes glowed at the edge of the light. Golden eyes burned through the glass of the sliding door. The bobcats. The mother crouched low, muscles coiled, teeth bared. Her young flanked her, tails whipping, their cries rising into the night like something ancient and untamed. Margaret's fear twisted into awe. They had returned, not as fleeting shadows this time, but as guardians. The man cursed, jerking back a step, torn between the threat outside and the silence inside. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, flashlight trembling in his grip. He had come expecting an easy target, a lonely widow in an isolated cabin. Instead, he had walked into something far wilder, something that belonged not to him but to the woods. And Margaret, hidden in the pantry, felt a new kind of resolve build inside her chest. The dispatcher's voice echoed faintly in her ear, telling her to stay still. But Margaret knew the moment was shifting. The intruder was losing control, and she could not stay cowering forever. Margaret's breath burned in her chest as she watched through the pantry crack. The intruder stood frozen in her kitchen, his body caught between two dangers, the growling fury at the sliding door and the possibility of discovery in the shadows. His flashlight trembled as it swept back and forth, catching glimpses of his mask, his gloved hands, the glint of the pry bar. He muttered a curse under his breath, low and tense, as if trying to convince himself he still had control. But Margaret could see it, the hesitation. He had not expected this. He had come for an easy mark, an elderly woman alone, far from neighbors, in a cabin no one would check on until morning. What he had found instead was resistance, both human and wild. The growl came again, louder this time. Margaret dared a glance toward the glass door. Luna, as she would later name the Bobcat mother, crouched with muscles coiled like springs. Her golden eyes never left the intruder. Her two young ones flanked her, their small bodies low, tails lashing furiously against the deck boards. Their cries rose in sharp, furious bursts, wild enough to raise the hairs on Margaret's arms even from her hiding place. The man turned toward them, raising the pry bar like a weapon. "Get out of here," he barked, but his voice cracked. The Bobcats did not retreat. They pressed closer to the glass, their bodies vibrating with raw instinct. Something shifted inside Margaret then. She realized she was no longer trembling from fear. She was angry. Angry at this stranger who had dared to enter her home. Angry at the years she had spent letting silence press her down. Angry that Walter wasn't here to protect the space they had built together. The anger burned hotter than the fear, steadying her in a way she had not expected. Quietly, she eased the pantry door open. The intruder was still focused on the Bobcats, his back to her. She moved into the kitchen like a shadow, her slippers making no sound on the wood floor. Her eyes fell on the cast-iron skillet resting on the counter. A heavy, black pan Walter had always joked could cook a feast or win a fight. Her hand closed around the handle. It felt almost too heavy at first, but when she raised it, her arms steadied. This was her home. She would not let him take it. The man stepped closer to the glass, waving the pry bar. The Bobcats responded with a frenzy of sound, claws raking against the doorframe, bodies hurling forward as if they might shatter the barrier. He flinched, and in that second Margaret acted. She swung. The skillet connected with his forearm in a sickening thud, knocking the pry bar from his grip. It clattered to the floor, metal ringing against wood. The man roared, stumbling back, the flashlight beam slicing across Margaret's face. For the first time, he saw her standing there, not a cowering widow, but a woman defiant, weapon in hand. He snarled, more beast than man now, and lunged at her. Margaret swung again, the skillet grazing his shoulder, but his strength was greater. He shoved her hard against the counter, pain sparking up her side. The phone tumbled from her pocket, skidding across the floor with the dispatcher's voice crackling faintly. "Ma'am, are you safe? Stay with me." Margaret gasped, her ribs aching, but she didn't drop the skillet. Her grip only tightened. The man raised his fist, preparing to strike, but the cabin exploded with sound. A crash rattled the walls as Luna hurled herself against the sliding door with full force. The glass shuddered in its frame, wood splintering under her claws. Ash and Willow followed, their cries sharp, relentless. The man froze, his eyes darting between Margaret and the wild storm clawing to get in. For the first time, he looked uncertain, truly uncertain. He had broken into many houses, perhaps, but never one defended by a widow's rage and 3 wild predators. Margaret seized the moment. She lifted the skillet high again, ignoring the throb in her side, and swung for his temple. He ducked at the last second, the pan grazing his mask, but it was enough to knock him off balance. He stumbled backward, crashing into the table, sending Margaret's cold cup of tea spilling across the wood. His breath came in ragged bursts now, curses muttered through clenched teeth. He bent to snatch up the pry bar, but red and blue lights suddenly spilled through the curtains. Sirens wailed down the road, growing louder, closer. The man's head jerked toward the sound. His bravado cracked entirely. He bolted for the hallway, sprinting toward the front door. Margaret staggered to her feet, skillet still in hand, just in time to see him yank the door open, only to collide with 2 deputies storming inside. The impact sent him sprawling. Shouts filled the cabin. "Down! Hands where we can see them!" In seconds, the prowler was pinned, wrists cuffed, dragged out into the night. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her chest heaving, tears burning her eyes. The skillet slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. Through the sliding door, she saw the Bobcats one last time, their golden eyes watching her from the deck. For a heartbeat, they held her gaze, silent now, their work complete. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they melted back into the woods, shadows swallowed by deeper shadow. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her chest. The dispatcher's voice still called faintly from the phone on the floor, but Margaret whispered to herself instead. "Guardians, my guardians." The flashing red and blue lights pulsed across the mountainside, painting the cedar walls of the cabin in stark, surreal colors. Margaret sat slumped in her armchair, the weight of the last hour pressing down on her bones like iron. Her chest still rose and fell too fast. Her palms still carried the ghost of the skillet's weight, and her ears still rang with the growls of the wild protectors that had stood guard outside. The deputies moved quickly, their boots echoing through the small cabin as they secured the scene. The intruder, stripped of his mask now, sat handcuffed on the porch, his face pale, jaw tight with rage and humiliation. One of the younger officers glanced at Margaret with wide eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe the story unfolding before him. A widow, a cast-iron skillet, and 3 bobcats that had turned a predator into prey. "Ma'am," the older deputy said gently, kneeling beside her. His name badge read Holloway. "You're safe now. He won't be coming back." Margaret managed a nod, though her voice still trembled. "I didn't do it alone." Her eyes drifted toward the sliding door. The deck lay empty now, save for claw marks gouged deep into the wood and a thin smear where the glass had quivered against Luna's fury. The bobcats were gone, melted back into the night as silently as they had arrived. Yet Margaret felt their presence still, lingering like a heartbeat at the edge of the forest. Holloway followed her gaze. "We'll get that glass reinforced for you. Stronger locks, too." But Margaret only whispered, "They kept me safe." The deputies exchanged looks, but neither spoke. They didn't need to understand. Margaret knew what she had seen, what she had felt. Those creatures hadn't come by chance. They had arrived at the moment she needed them most, as if summoned by something greater than coincidence. Hours later, when the flashing lights disappeared down the gravel road and the quiet returned to the cabin, Margaret finally allowed herself to exhale. She gathered the skillet from the floor, setting it gently on the counter as though laying down a sword after battle. Her hands trembled as she touched the cool metal. Walter had always said it could win a fight. She wished he could see her now. Exhaustion pressed in, but sleep would not come. Instead, she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped onto the deck. The night was still, the pines swaying softly against the star-strewn sky. She traced the claw marks with her fingers, rough grooves carved deep into the wood, proof that it hadn't been a dream. At the edge of the yard, the mist hung low. For a moment, she thought she saw them, the glint of golden eyes watching from the tree-line. Her breath caught. The mother bobcat stood tall, the 2 younger shadows flanking her once more. Silent, unblinking, they held her gaze. Margaret's lips curved into the smallest smile. She raised her hand in a trembling wave, and though she knew they could not understand words, she whispered anyway. "Thank you." The bobcats did not move closer, nor did they turn away immediately. They lingered, as though acknowledging her, then slipped back into the forest, their shapes dissolving into darkness. Margaret remained at the railing long after they had gone, her heart lighter than it had been in years. By dawn, when the first pale streaks of sunlight painted the Blue Ridge horizon, Margaret sat with a notebook open on the kitchen table. For months it had collected dust, its pages empty, its pen untouched. But now her hand moved steadily, spilling words across the paper. She wrote of fear and fury, of wild guardians with golden eyes, of a night when silence broke and courage returned. The phone rang mid-morning. Her daughter Emily's voice rushed through the line, worried, urgent. "Mom, the sheriff called. Oh my God, are you okay? You have to come live with us now. Please." Margaret listened, her pen stilling for only a moment. She glanced out the window toward the woods, where sunlight touched the apple tree and the claw marks shone faintly on the deck. "Emily," she said softly but firmly, "this is my home, and I'm not alone here anymore." There was silence on the other end, then the sound of her daughter's muffled tears. Margaret's eyes burned too, but she smiled through them. That evening, as dusk fell once more and crickets sang in the grass, Margaret brewed her tea and set Walter's old camera by the window. She didn't know if the Bobcats would return, but she felt their presence all the same. Not just as animals, but as guardians, sentinels on silent paws who had chosen, for reasons she might never understand, to stand with her when she needed them most. The cabin no longer felt like a museum of memories. It felt alive again, and as the wind moved gently through the pines, Margaret whispered to the night, a vow as much to herself as to the woods. "He picked the wrong house.